Hello and welcome to my latest video. In this video I'm going to be painting these Saturnine Terminators which Games Workshop sent me as early review copies. You can see the models are completely built and primed black. Now I'm going to be painting these as Imperial Fists and they're going to be in my army, so these are going to be for tabletop standard. Now they're probably going to be a bit higher than tabletop standard because I like to paint a bit extra on them, but they are relatively quick to do. If you want to paint yours a little bit better than this, or just have an easier time on getting into some of the harder to reach areas, I would strongly suggest leaving the shoulder pads off because they do kind of block a lot of area on the models. You can see for the first thing that I've done after priming them black is to use a pink layer, and I just airbrushed this all over. You can use something like Wild Rider Red and that'll be a nice base to work from. You don't have to airbrush that layer on, you can do it by hand, it's just a lot quicker if you do it by airbrush. The next stage, I'm going to airbrush not quite zenithal, I'm just going to be focusing on the highlight points. So you need an off-white colour. The reason I say off-white is because if you use a pure white, it's just a little bit harder to airbrush. So I tend to go for an off-white for the lighter colours. And all I'm doing here is placing highlights where I want them to be for the highlights on the yellow of the armour. So this is like a pre-highlight. And if you don't do this, what will happen is when we put the yellow on over the pink, it'll be quite a dark, and it'll look sort of an orangey looking yellow, a dark orangey yellow. Whereas with these highlights, and you can see the highlight placement is on the prominent forward sections where the light naturally falls. So if you just hold the model under a lamp, you'll see where the light falls naturally anyway. So after you've done this to all the models, we're going to airbrush on some Imperial Fists contrast paint. And you'll see straight away when this goes on, it makes a huge impact, and you'll be able, because of the pre-highlight stage that you've done, those areas will be very yellow, and then as I mentioned, the areas that are left pink, those are going to look like sort of an orangey yellow kind of colour. So you've already got a highlighted and shaded Imperial Fist Space Marine very, very quickly at this stage. As we go along, I'm going to be adding more and more detail to it, but what you should find is if you are happy with the way it looks, then don't be afraid to stop and just use it as a gaming piece at that point. So for example here, it already looks quite nice with the highlighted and shaded sections. So if you just went over the whole model, picked out the metal sections and then gave those a wash, you have something that actually is quite striking on the tabletop already. One thing I will say as well though is that as I progress through this, with all the different layers and techniques that I use, the yellow colour becomes more desaturated. So I'll tell you just before the main impact of that happens, and it just depends on whether you want that desaturated look, because I'm going for a very sort of weathered and beaten look to mine, so I don't want a super strong yellow for the final result. Also, you might notice that the model's quite shiny. That is because of the Imperial Fist contrast paint. One of the reasons for that is I'm going to be using some oils on the model, and this slightly shiny satin finish will help the oils be pushed into the recesses more than covering the entire model. I'm also using some black there just to fill in some sections on the shoulder pad, just to break up the massive yellow on the model. So it's entirely optional if you want to do this or not. And then I've used some putty. It's just some random putty, you can get it from anywhere really, and just blocked out the sections where I don't want any of the paint to go. Don't worry about the trim because we're going to be painting that by hand anyway. And then I've used a grey colour, so something like Mechanicum standard grey would be good for this. And you're doing the same thing again as when you did the pre-highlight stage on the yellow. You might be a bit confused on why I was doing the pre-highlight stage on some of the shoulders and things. I hadn't exactly planned on where I wanted on which models I wanted to have black shoulder pads on. So for the unit, there is one model with 2 black shoulder pads, one model with 1 black shoulder pad, and one with no black shoulder pads. So the unit is not the same. I don't know if that's acceptable or not going by the law, but I think it should be fine. But you should feel free to do whatever variation you want, or indeed not have black shoulder pads. It doesn't really matter too much. But then after you've done the airbrush stage, the next thing is to cover all of the metal trim. Now you can do whatever metal colours you want on this. So for the chest eagle I've kept that gold, and then every other part of the model I'm just painting it sort of like a steel color. And again, whichever metal color you want, it really shouldn't make that much difference. The reason I say that is because there's going to be so many layers of oil and glaze going over them that the color is going to be quite different to whatever the base color is. One thing I will say though is if you want to make the metals stand out more, you could do a black layer before you put the metals on, so the metals will then just be stronger over a black base. Because when you paint them over the yellow trim, the yellow, there's an element of translucency to the metal paint as you apply it, so the yellow will show through a little bit. That doesn't bother me because I'm going to have a very sort of yellow worn, kind of rusty look to my metals anyway, so that just sort of enhances that. But if you want like a stronger looking metal, then a black base will help. Now the next stage, you can see actually I'm painting on the weathering, but at this point in time you can also stick on the decals. I haven't shown you how to do that. There's a million tutorials online to find how to do it, but all I've done is literally just slapped on the decals and used some microset, which is kind of like vinegar really, and just put that on the decals and they will set pretty well like that. I don't use anything else on them because I'm going to be putting a layer of matte varnish over it, and with the oils as well, it'll all blend in, so you won't see any variation between the decal and the paint around it. But so after that, we're sticking on the weathering. So I'm painting the weathering by hand, and I'm using Rhinox hide. The reason I'm doing it by hand is you get much nicer marks. It does take a little bit longer, but you can see I've got like spider sort of cracking, and you have more control over the shapes and the position of the weathering. But you can use a sponge if you want, and what is probably the best solution is if you want some very heavily weathered sections on it, use a sponge first and then painting by hand afterwards. But just be a little bit careful with the sponge because it's very easy to go over the top and just get sort of like chips all over in the wrong places, and it can very quickly look like a copy, like a clone stamp tool, because you do the same marks over and over with the sponge. You also saw there I used Mephiston red and I painted in the sergeant's helmet red. That's just to get everything ready, and because now we're going to do the first stage with the oils. So I'm using burnt sienna, and then you thin the oil down, mix it all together, and you should end up with something that looks very loose and watery, quite translucent, but you should still be able to tell the colour of it. Now it is important when you're doing this, don't use your standard painting brushes because you will wreck them, and you know, if you're using like natural hair, you'll wreck the brushes, and you won't. Definitely don't put them in your water jar because that won't clean them. They have to be cleaned with this mineral spirits. So I strongly suggest that you have separate brushes for your oils, and like try and keep all of your acrylic stuff away from the painting desk while you're using the oils. So now when it comes to the oils, what you'll find is, because of the slightly satin finish on the paint, when you start applying it, it will run more into the recesses and it won't pool very much on the surface. If you find there is too much pooling, you can just wipe it off. So you can use like a cotton bud or a bit of kitchen roll, and it's very easy to, like, it doesn't dry very quickly, so you don't have to be very quick at working it. Just cover the whole model. Well, for the metals, completely cover them. For the yellow armor, try and focus on the recesses anyway, because it will sort of bleed out a little bit. You will find the whole model tends to go a bit sort of darker and richer with this process. If you don't like using oils, I am going to be painting one of the dreadnoughts, and I'm not going to use an airbrush at all, and I'm not going to use any oils, but I'm going to get a very similar look. So you can look forward to that in the future, but for this one, because I wanted to do these very quick and get it like a nicer effective result quickly, and have them really grimy, then I went for airbrush and oil. So it is a little bit more tricky to do this if you don't have these things, but I will be doing the dreadnought, as I said, without any of them, and it'll just be acrylic paint, so that'll be something else to check out later. But you can see as I'm applying this, I'm using quite a thin, well, it's a very worn out brush, but I'm using quite a thin brush and focusing onto like all the panel lines and all that kind of thing. What you will also find is because on the shoulder pads where you've airbrushed on the grey colour, and also it was hand painted with black, so that doesn't have the satin finish. When the oils touch those, it will bleed more into the colours. But don't worry about that, because although it bleeds in, it just makes them look more grimy, and you tend to not get the staining in the same way. It just sort of very gradually bleeds through the whole thing. You'll still see the grey transition there, but it gives a slightly different effect, and it makes it look quite nice and sort of heavily weathered. But also you could want that same effect on the rest of the model. And when I add the matte varnish, so you could have done it in like a different order, and you could have just matte varnished the whole model before doing any of the oil work, and it would have the same effect. But that will mean that the model will go much darker when you do this. But you don't have to be very neat when you're doing it. Also, just to take note, it's the reason that I did the decals before doing the oil work or any of the other work afterwards is because the decals will then also be affected by the oil, so they become more weathered in there. And also, it also helps to sort of blend them into the model as well. You can be a bit quicker than I'm being here. Like, I'm just trying to be nice and thorough to make sure every recess and thing gets hit. But because of the nature of the oils and the capillary action, the oil paint will naturally just be pulled into a lot of the details anyway. So you could very quickly just go over the model, picking out things and not worry too much about it. Because especially with the additional work that I'm going to be doing to it, nearly anything that is missed will just, it'll get covered over anyway. Also, what I would say is, you can see the lenses, they're left yellow at the moment. If you'd painted those in black, and then after this oil wash, I actually think this is perfectly fine for gaming as well. I just like to spend a bit more time painting my models, but I think, say at this stage, if you'd painted in the lenses black, it would be perfect for gaming. And here's another one that I've done as well at this stage. And again, I think these look fine as gaming pieces. Now here I have done the matte varnish over it. You can see straight away that the yellow has dulled down a bit. That's not because of anything to do with the oils. That's literally the difference it makes from having a satin finish to a matte finish. It changes the look of the colour. So it doesn't matter if it was yellow or red or whatever. Because of a matte finish, it diffuses the light over it, so you have less colour on there, and also it loses some of the wet look as well that you would have with say like a gloss finish. Like gloss gives the strongest colour representation. Then with the matte varnish, because you have the diffused light with the sort of the broken finish due to the matte varnish, it just makes everything look a little bit more pastel. But it also means that some of the next paint processes that I use will work differently because of the matte varnish. You can see here I'm going back with the grey colour I use. So remember, like if you want to use something like a Mechanicum standard grey, and just going over the decal on the shoulder, so it's a little bit chipped and weathered. And then for the yellow, you may need to mix up a yellow to kind of match it now, because it will, like if you just used the Imperial Fist contrast paint, clearly that won't work, because those are very translucent. They work like inks and they will not cover this. So you have to get your own yellow, get it kind of similar. You could try something like Abaddon Sunset, maybe lighten it a little bit with like a Wraithbone or a Screaming Skull, something like that, just to lighten it a tiny touch, and that will give you quite an opaque looking paint. And then you just go over the black decals for chipping. Don't go too crazy with this, because one, the yellow will still stand out slightly, but also we are going to be glazing over these sections a little bit later. I'll explain why when we glaze over them when we get to it, but it's not something that you need to spend a lot of time on. Just some little dobs of paint here and there just to make it look like the decals have been scratched. And you can see I'm using a very small brush when I'm doing this, like a size 00. Don't worry about that. Any kind of brush will do as long as it's got a reasonable tip on it for just doing like tiny dots and things. When you're doing these sort of scratches as well, try not to make everything symmetrical. So if you wanted, you could literally wipe out half of the decal, leaving little bits obviously, but you can do very focused areas that are heavily weathered and other sections that have no weathering on at all. So it's very unlikely that weathering from impacts and battle damage and things would be symmetrical on an area. And that's true for also when you're painting on the Rhinox hide on the chipping as well. Try not to make things symmetrical. You want to make it asymmetrical and random, kind of chaotic looking, and that will then look more natural. I'm also now just painting in any of the gems or lenses that are going to be sort of painted as gems later on. So I'm painting them in black first. I'm not doing that for the eyes. The eyes will be painted the same colour as the gems, but the eyes are going to have a very, very minor OSL effect, so nothing too fancy. And just speaking of OSL, by the way, you will see that the plasma weapons, I'm not sure what they're called, but they are painted at the end of the video, but I don't show you how to do them in this. I was going to do them as very strong OSL, and then I changed my mind later on, so I just finished them off camera. I will probably... Well, I mean, they'll be in the next video when I do the Dreadnought, but I didn't think it was worth showing them in this because I wasn't sure on how I was going to do them. So they're just sort of like very basic kind of glow effects without any kind of secondary glow on the armor or anything like that. So it wasn't something that I was too focused on. This is just showing you how to paint the armor and the weathering and things like that. But for the lenses here, I'm using Sotek green. It's a little bit messy on the wet palette in the top left there. Try and ignore the yellow colours. And the I think it's Rhinox hide, or I know it might be black, whatever. But so the Sotek green is in the bottom middle, then above that is just adding various like lighter colours. Now you can, if you want like a warmer highlight colour, something like Dawn Yellow, but otherwise you can just add white to it as it gets lighter, so you have different stages. You don't need all of the stages of highlight that you can see on there. Those were just mixed in case I decided to use them. But the first stage, you do like a dot in the top left and then a circle going all the way around. So this isn't quite the same way that Games Workshop do their gems. What they tend to do is dark in the top left and then transitions down to through the colour to highlights in the bottom right and then a white dot in the top left. What I've done is a circle all the way around it, then a large dot in the top left, and then the successive highlights, it gets smaller around the ring, little sort of bling highlight in the bottom right of the gem, and then another dot of white in the top left. So it's not quite as shiny as the Games Workshop gems, but it's very eye-catching, and it's just easier to see on the tabletop because of the large highlight amount on it. The lenses here, so again you block them in with Sotek green. You go with the next stage highlight and leaving some of the Sotek green, the base Sotek green, visible in the recesses, and also painting up towards the eye lenses. Now when you put this colour on, ideally it needs to be kind of similar in brightness to the yellow armour. If you went straight with Sotek green when you do this, it's going to be darker, so that looks a little bit strange because the glow is supposed to be light hitting the armor, and if the light from the environment is lighter than the lens glow, it wouldn't really show up too much because it would be overpowering on it. So you need to have a color that's very similar in brightness to the yellow armor, but still kind of visible. I mean, we are sort of being a little bit artistic with our choices here, because really in daylight a glow from these eyes would be almost invisible. So you go through the stages of highlight, you pick up the lower edge on the armor just below the eye lens for one stage highlight above the glow that you painted on, and then you take the eye all the way up to white in the very middle. So each successive layer of highlight that you paint on there, you want it a little bit smaller each time, so there's a very tiny amount of the previous layer visible at the edges. Now don't be too precious when you do it, like it can be a bit tricky because it's a small area to paint these lenses in, but if you could just leave a little bit of a transition each time, it just adds the hint of colour to help sell the OSL, because otherwise you're just left with a white eye. But really the colour around that's left on the yellow armour, so the Sotek green that you can see that's visible, that gives the colour to the eye. It's not necessarily much of the eye itself. For the veteran sergeant here, I'm going to be painting a white stripe down the middle of his helmet, using the grey that we painted onto the shoulder pad, and this time just adding a small amount of white to it, so it's a light grey. The reason for a light grey and not a white for a start is that means that I have space to then highlight it up to white on the curve at the front, but also it's just a little bit easier to paint an off-white than it is a white, because it's quite easy sometimes for white to go a bit chalky, and you just get like a smoother finish using an off-white colour. The best way to do this is to just paint a line down the middle of the helmet to start with, like a very thin line, and then slowly widen it as you go. And once you've got something that looks kind of even, then you can neaten each side, and you've got a little bit of leeway in that you can, if it's not quite perfect, you can just sort of make it a tiny bit bigger each time to try and straighten that line. But if you can't manage that still, don't worry about it, because when we come to the weathering, you can kind of hide any faults within the straightness of the line. You'll break it up, and just some little red dots and things like that, it'll look much neater. But after you've done the stripe, you need to highlight the front of it, so you add a bit more white to it, and you're just painting the front curve on the forehead, so not all of the stripe. And the best way to paint the lines on something like this is lots of draw lines. So you can see as I use the brush, I load it up with the paint, and I'm pulling the brush towards me with each mark. That brush stroke is the one that you have the most control over, but try and do it so that you do it from, first of all, painting it when the model's the right way up, and then do it upside down and paint towards the highlight point each time. And that will, what will happen is the paint, as you remove it from the model, it leaves a little bit of an extra deposit each time, so the highlight is built up more on the highlight point, and you get a kind of a small transition doing it that way. And then the final stage is just to use white on its own on the front curve for the, like, as I said, the shine on the forehead. Now you don't have to put weathering on the stripe, but I think it kind of fits in a little bit better with within universe, it's just like a painted on stripe, same as the decals and things, they'd all be done the same way, so it makes sense that the stripe would be weathered as well. Just be a little bit careful, because obviously it's taken a bit longer to paint the stripe on than it has to put a decal on, so if you mess up, it's more effort to fix it. But so just using the Mephiston red, what you want to do is, for a start off, just chip the edge slightly. So remember when I said if you can't get like a perfectly straight line on it, then anything that looks a bit wonky, just put some chipping over the top of that. And then if you want to put like a couple of lines or something going through it to represent scrapes, that can look interesting as well. There is a danger sometimes when doing this sort of weathering that you spend more time on the weathering on an area like this than the rest of the model, so it can actually look artificial because it will stand out as different from the other weathering, and to an extent I've done that, but I think it still looks sort of interesting anyway, so I'm not too bothered, but it's just something to be aware of. Now we're going to highlight the red. So remember the base was Mephiston red, although it did have some oil over it, because remember we put the red base colour down before we did the oil wash. Now the next stage is Evil Sun Scarlet, and you're doing the same highlight placement as you did on the white stripe. So the forward curve that catches the highlight area, you're not covering the whole section of the helmet with this. And I'm just painting it in a very similar way, so draw strokes towards me, because it's giving me the most amount of control. Then you turn the model upside down again and do the same from the bottom up. And then you also need to just pick out some of the other parts on the front of the face. So he's got like his little breather sections or whatever they are, but you know, the bits of the lower face. There is also his face mask. So you can see here I'm picking out one side because he only has one eye, because the other is a lens. So the eye obviously has the OSL glow, so you don't want to paint any highlight on the face mask on that side, because that'll just wreck it. So I've only highlighted one side on it, so it's a little bit weird looking, like it's not necessarily realistic, but I'm not going to be spending too much time on this being perfect with all the light placement and things. I'm just doing this so it looks interesting and creates a bit of contrast within the highlight point. If you want, you could just do a line down the middle of it as well. It's up to you. But then after doing the Evil Sun's Scarlet, then you can do a very final small highlight of Wild Rider Red. Now here, this is kind of, it's not super necessary. You can skip this stage if you want, but if you just want to push the highlights a little bit on the black sections of the shoulder pad, we are using an off-white or a light grey colour, the same as like the base colour on the stripe on the forehead. So you have to mix this yourself, but you just take the, say, Mechanicum standard grey, add a little bit of white to it so it's a light grey colour, then you just glaze up towards the top section of the shoulder pad. And we're going to be doing a lot of glazing. So at this stage, the model is fine, like it's really good to game with at this stage. All of this from now on is kind of unnecessary work, and it's purely on how much time and effort you want to spend on the model, making it just look a little bit more interesting. So I just enjoy painting my models and spending a bit of time on, you know, especially lighting effects on them, and, you know, getting some nice transitions. So this is an entirely optional stage. But the colours I have there, starting with Mournfang Brown, this is turned into a glaze. Now I've watered this down very, very heavily. And you can only do this glazing if you put the matte varnish on. The satin finish of the contrast paint from the airbrush will make glazing very hard because the paint would kind of bead on it. It won't give you a nice finish really. But with the matte finish from the matte varnish, the glaze will sort of bleed into it as well. So it actually, even if you struggle a little bit with your glazing, it should still sort of bleed into it and do kind of a nice transition. You need a very big brush for this. There's a lot of area to cover with the glazing. The paint needs to be watered down a lot. You can see I'm using a well palette here, so there's a small amount of paint. It's like 6 or 7 parts water to 1 part paint, and it's a good idea really to do all the models at the same time, so you can very quickly cover one model, then go to the next one, and then the next one. By the time you've done the third one, the first one's completely dry, so you can get through this very quickly. You also might want to use a hairdryer to speed up the drying process if you're just doing one, or just live in the UK with the heat at the moment, because that made the paint dry pretty quickly as well. So for the highlight here, you can use something like Dawn Yellow, or you can mix your own colour. So if you took Yriel Yellow and added some white to it, that will give you the same sort of colour, but it's a sort of pastel yellow colour. And you have to be a little bit careful with this. Glazing any colour that's got white pigment in it, it's very easy to go wrong. You can get something that looks a little bit cloudy, you can get brush marks on it, and you can get sort of a texture build-up. But you're doing the same thing. You're highlighting towards the highlight point. Remember when we painted the stripe on the forehead, how I said you paint towards the highlight point from one side, then you paint toward. You always stop at the brightest point on the highlight. So when you're glazing on the light yellow color, the pastel yellow color, you're stopping at the brightest point, and you can go in from multiple directions, but always stop. Don't go past the brightest point when you take the brush off. Here, so this is a little kind of weird thing that I've done. So I went back to the oils with the burnt umber because I decided that the burnt sienna was not dark enough in the recesses. I wanted more contrast on this. So I've gone in with some burnt umber. Same thing again, where you have to thin it down. And I'm just using a thin brush again. But if you remember when I talked about this, when you first applied the oil paint on the satin finish, it would just go into the recesses. Now it won't do that. It'll bleed into the model. I would also probably suggest that you do. So I did it slightly in the wrong order because I hadn't planned this when I did it. I've just left it at this stage in the video because this is the exact order that I painted things. But I would suggest when you do this that you do the oil, the burnt umber stage before doing any of the glazing, because you don't really want to be mixing your acrylics anywhere near your oils. And also when you've done the oil, you need to leave that to dry for a long time. But because it's an oil wash, it should dry pretty quickly, but you definitely need to leave it overnight so it's properly set before doing any of the glazing on. So I painted these 3 models over the course of a week, just doing bits here and there in my spare time. But it's just, you know, it's better to follow that process where you've got the matte varnish on, then do the burnt umber, and then go on to the glazing. So just going back to the colours that I'm using for the glazing. So this is Mournfang brown again, and it will blend really nicely onto the model with the colours that we've used. Mournfang brown's a fantastic colour to glaze with anyway, because of the matte varnish. It will also, as I mentioned, bleed into the colours on the model as well. And you can go backwards and forwards between these highlight stages, so going from the pastel yellow to the Mournfang brown, but do the opposite direction depending on what you're doing. So if it's the pastel yellow, you're painting towards the highlight point. If it's the Mournfang brown, you're painting towards the shadow sections. Also, the Mournfang brown is not the darkest brown that you can go to, so you need a darker brown as well to push the contrast even more, which will get closer in colour to the burnt umber. So something like Rhinox hide will do that. Again, all of these colours should be watered down to something like 6 or 7 parts water to 1 part paint. This is also the area where you're massively desaturating the colour of the yellow, and you can, the more of the pastel yellow, so remember like Dawn yellow with a, or like a Yriel yellow with some white added to it, the more of that you add, the less yellow the model is. However, you can then glaze back the yellow into it. So this model here that I've done is not quite as yellow as the others, but if you want to push the yellow back in a little bit more, you can see on the far right of the screen there in the top right, I've got the Yriel yellow and I've turned that into a glaze as well. I'll also be adding some orange glazes, and those will go in like the transition colors. So if you just need a little bit more color saturation back in there as well, that can just, like, he looks a bit like a Satsuma, but it's like you've got like an orange and a yellow element, but he's very, so as I said, the look that I was going for was very heavily weathered, desaturated, and, you know, just heavily used. Also, you can see that I'm glazing over the weathering, the chipping and the decals, especially on the chest. That gives the impression, one, that the decal within universe is being weathered off as well, but also it gives the impression that light is hitting it, and light would obviously naturally lighten everything underneath it, so the decal should naturally be lighter because of that. Now, you can spend as long doing this as you want. Like, if you wanted to really push this piece to a very high level, you could do this, you use a smaller brush and you can glaze in all sorts of bits. But not everything has to be glazed. Like, the glazing is really nice on these big empty flat panels, but it's a bit of a pain when it comes to any of the details. Like, if you wanted to go and do the sections behind the head, I've just left these as sort of like a darker brown. They get glazed over with the Mournfang brown and things, but they don't get that much attention. But if you wanted to really take time on this and get loads of detail and make it really, you know, like a Golden Demon entry or something, you probably want to paint all those other bits. Then it's probably a good idea to use some slightly thicker paint just to pick out some of the details, and you can glaze it later to soften the transitions and make them look nice, that kind of way. But also, one important thing with the glazing, especially with the Mournfang brown, but also with the Rhinox hide, is that you're glazing over the metal trim as well as on the yellow. This will help to really push the sort of grimy, rusted look on the metal. So there's no actual rust element that I'm going to be painting on. It's not like I'm going to be adding textured rust or anything like that. But don't be afraid to glaze over them, also with slightly some of the lighter colors as well. So you could use the orange here as well, glazing over the metals. That will definitely push the orange element to it. Because these are so watered down, there's not a massive impact. It does take a while to build up, and I'm sure some of you are watching this and you're thinking, well, this is not the quickest way to, you know, it's not that quick to paint an army like this. It honestly does not take that long. It's only a few hours per model in terms of active painting time, but there is a long process of waiting for oils to dry. So the reason that I say that is because when I paint the Dreadnought, because I'm not using oils, the process, like the active painting time, will be a little bit longer because the oils do a lot of heavy lifting on this, but the the actual time it takes to paint the dreadnought is probably going to be a little bit quicker, because you don't have to wait for the oils to dry. I'll just be using acrylic paint and it'll be, you know, done within moments. But once you've got all of that filled in, and you can see here where I've painted in the plasma sort of effects on the weapons, and as I mentioned, I'm not covering that in this video, but they're, you know, they're not amazing anyway. They're just there to fill it in. And I will do something better on the dreadnought. But for the metals here, pick out the shoulders and try and match. So again, hold it under a lamp, see where the light falls on it. It's mainly going to be on the curved sections, on the ball joints, on like the hips, and the curved sections on the shoulders, like the forward facing curved sections. So they're very quick and easy to pick those sections out. And that's pretty much it. Then all I've done is put some sand on the base. I gave a wash of Rhinox hide after the sand had dried. After that was done, I just covered the base and the lower sections of the feet in some weathering powder. And I didn't bother to set it because I don't touch the bases afterwards. So unless you're going to reactivate it all with some water or whatever, you really don't have to worry about that kind of thing. Like if you're spilling your Pepsi on it or whatever, which you should probably keep away from your models. I don't really see much point in worrying about setting the weathering powder on there, and that's it. That's pretty much how to do the models, and that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.